Hey guys, Buick update 35 here. So I've been driving around, having a great time. The engine's running great. I got almost 300-400 miles on it at this point. But by the time it warms up and I park at a light, I started noticing that there was like this ticking sound. And I swear, I looked up and down, left and right. I know that exhaust leaks can disguise themselves as lifter ticks a lot of the time, but also the thing is after I replaced the valve springs with these higher rate valve springs after initial cam break-in, at 50 or 100 miles, I noticed, I noticed that when I had put the rockers back on and then relashed everything to zero lash plus a half turn, just like the Lunati guide mentions, it just rattled like crazy. The lifters were just making awful sounds, like like there was a half a turn off of zero lash, and everything was just clattering like no tomorrow. And after I did that and I ran it for a while, I would warm up, and then I noticed that one or two or three lifters back toward the back, they would start clicking, and it just rubbed me the wrong way. So I started looking into it, and again, the first thing I did, I looked up and down for exhaust leaks. I put my phone up to every little piece of the engine I could possibly think of, because the iPhone has a microphone right next to the camera, and because of that, I would be able to sweep across the engine and notice where obviously the sounds get louder when I would watch the video back. And that was great, and that kind of led me to find a few things. One, the Holley Sniper injectors are incredibly loud, but it's not, and it sounds almost like a lifter tick a bit, but it is a lot, I guess, higher pitch than you would imagine a lifter could, because like an injector tick is pretty high, then a little bit lower, then you get lifter ticks, lower in pitch, I mean, not in engine. And then once you get much lower, then you start running into things like piston slap or rod knock. And I went through process of elimination, and because it happened when it was warm, it wasn't piston slap. It's a brand new engine, it runs great, so it's not rod knock, it's not shaking the engine apart. And I checked all of these different connections that I have and all the V-band clamps that I have, and the connections for the turbo to the exhaust manifold. And I even actually took my shop vac and put the positive pressure side on the end of my muffler to blow air into the exhaust side to start finding any and all exhaust leaks. And I did find a couple, but they're not that bad and they don't make that sound. So long story short, it ended up being the valves, and I ended up relashing them like 3 different times. But here's the interesting part. So after relashing the valves correctly, it clattered like nobody's business, just like I had remembered once I installed the new valve springs and then put it at half lash. And I remember when I installed the new valve springs, I kind of specifically remember it clattered like crazy, so I just thought, oh, well, this can't be zero lash. So I tightened it down past what I know now is zero lash, to essentially bottoming out the lifter to where it was working more like a solid lifter than it was an actual hydraulic lifter. Now that ran fine for quite some time because it wasn't adjusting the lash really at all, but it was probably hanging a valve open, maybe just ever so slightly, and I would have like the slightest rough idle, and everything, but everything worked fine minus a handful of lifters. So after relashing everything, when it rattled like crazy, I just could not figure it out. I put my camera up and I would look back and forth and back and forth. I'd sweep the camera across all the rockers to find the loud ones. All the push rods still spun, so the cam was just fine. I even took one of the lifters out of the bore and noticed that because it was hard. But it was the interesting part is that was the only hard lifter I had when adjusting all of these rockers. All of them were soft, and that got me to thinking how a hydraulic lifter actually works. And actually, I probably put it up, but anyway, the plunger inside of a hydraulic lifter is supposed to squish down a little bit, and then as the lifter fills with oil, then once you set the lash, then once it fills with oil, once the engine runs, then it becomes solid. so that when it moves up and down, any extra play as time goes on and it gets a little bit longer and a little bit longer, the bottom will then fill with oil and take up that extra lash. And that got me to thinking, if I had bottomed these out, then that means that they never would have filled with oil, so lashing them correctly actually would have left a lot of air in them, causing them to compress and tick the whole time after lashing them properly. So because of that, because I thought I was onto something, I actually took my distributor back out and put a drill into the oil pump and then just ran the oil pressure up, because the other important thing was that I only ever ran it for maybe 30 to 60 seconds, and when it was clattering like crazy, I just stopped, and I just figured I must have done something wrong. But after setting everything to the correct lash, in the correct position in the plunger compression, I took my distributor out and took a power drill and manually ran up the oil pressure to full bore for 20-30 seconds, and then would bump the engine, run it up 20-30 seconds, bump it 20-30 seconds, and that way the lifter, as it was in the bore, as it was seated and not opened by the cam, would have a fresh full supply of oil pressure going into the lifter. And then I could, once it was filled with oil, then it would come up through each of the push rods, and then I could see that at correct lash, the lifter was full of oil and it was running through all the push rods. So because of that, after doing that, everything quieted down immensely. And at probably 80-90%, before I did it, they all clattered like crazy. Then I did this, and then probably all but maybe one or two had a slight tick, and then I just did it again, and now it's almost completely gone. But here's the interesting part. I know that there's still just tiny bits of air here and there, and now I feel much better about reassembling the engine, or I guess putting the valve cover back on, because now I know that just by applying oil pressure to the lifter while it's in its seat in the bore, that removes all the extra lash and removes the extra sound. That was the only thing I did in order to stop it from clattering at correct half turn lash. So I'm feeling much better about this. It was driving me crazy, but the only thing that's mildly concerning is that all of these rockers are looking great except for this one, and it doesn't have nearly as much oil coming through it as the rest of them. The other ones spray quite a bit, but this one just kind of has it peeking through. I took the push rod out, blew through it. It's perfectly fine. I took the side cover off and saw that the lifter was spraying oil up out of the center hole into the push rod. When I would take the push rod out, there was some oil in it. So I think it's relatively safe to assume that it might just need the oil to warm up and thin out in order for it to start coming out of the oiling hole in the rocker. But other than that, I'm feeling much better about it. It runs nice, it runs quiet, and after I put this valve cover back on, I'm hoping to have no more clicky-clacky valves. So the only other thing I wanted to mention from my previous video was I know I had that awful sound coming whenever I would hot dog it on the shifting, and I would hit some bumpy roads, and I ended up finding that it was actually the drive shaft hitting the floor pan just right about there. And one really interesting point that confirmed that was I was able to, when it was really bad, when the engine was decelerating and it was probably just ever so slightly rocking to one side in order to bring the drive shaft up to tap the floor pan, I was able to actually push down on the floor pan, and it made the knocking just slightly worse. So I'm 1000% sure that that's what it is. And the only thing I really needed to do to remedy it was the 2 bolts that are responsible for holding up the transmission mount on the cross member. I just loosened them up and then pulled the transmission a bit to the side and then tightened them back down good and tight. And that probably 30 second inch of movement stopped almost all of the clattering sound. So So that's much nicer. I really hope that at some point it doesn't come back or it doesn't vibrate to the other side a little bit. And but the only other real solution at that point would be to maybe put a jack in a block and then just push the floor pan and bend it up ever so slightly. Because I looked, and that is the correct transmission mount and it is the correct height. So it may just be that when I was welding in new floor pans, I might have sagged the floor pans ever so slightly to cause that issue. But other than that, it's running great. Now that I'm at 300-400 miles, I'm starting to get into boost and 5 PSI, and man, this thing, it just scoots. I'm currently running only 32 degrees of timing at 0 PSI, and I'm taking a degree out for every pound of boost. So in boost at 5 PSI, it's only seeing about 28 degrees of timing, but I'm just being super conservative during these probably the first 500, maybe 1,000 miles, because after that, I think if I remember correctly, it likes 36 degrees of full or of total timing at 0 degrees of boost, and then that would also shift up my the amount of timing that I have once I'm in boost. So I would probably expect to see maybe 31 degrees once I'm at 5 PSI. So other than that, it's running great, looking great, sounding a lot better, and thanks for watching.